I'd now like to introduce Dr. Bas Bloem. Dr. Bloem is considered one of the world's top experts on Parkinson's disease. He is a professor and neurologist in the Department of Neurology at Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands. He received his medical degree with honor at Leiden University Medical Center in 1993. In 1994, he obtained his PhD degree in Leiden based on a thesis entitled Postural Reflexes in Parkinson's Disease. He was trained as a neurologist between 1994 to 2000. He received additional training as movement disorders specialist during fellowships at the Parkinson's Institute in Sunnyvale, California, and at the Institute of Neurology, Queen Square, London. Recently, he has co-authored the book Ending Parkinson's Disease, A Prescription for Action. Dr. Bloem, welcome. I will pass it over to you now.
Thank you for your very kind introduction. Let me start sharing the screen here. And hopefully you can confirm that you can see it now.
I can, thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you kindly for the invitation. For me, as a Dutch neurologist, it's extra special to speak to people in Canada because, as you're probably well aware, there are strong bonds between the Netherlands and Canada for a wide variety of reasons. Many people left the Netherlands after the Second World War to go to Canada. So there is a strong blood connection between our two countries. But I think all of us in the Netherlands are eternally grateful for all the Canadian lives that were given during the war to ascertain our freedom and liberty. In particularly my area of the world, Nijmegen is where the famous war movie and the war event One Bridge Too Far was recorded. It's where Canadian paratroopers tried to release the city where I'm now working at the cost of many, many lives. There is still a Canadian cemetery just around the corner here, which is exceptionally well maintained, more than 50 years after the war. Always gives me the goosebumps when I'm there. The maple leaf is everywhere. There are trees carrying the maple leaf. And I just wanted to say thank you, because it is special for us to have this exceptional relationship with Canada. So my main disclosure is I'm Dutch. You can see a Dutch neurologist in the typical Dutch countryside practicing medicine, typically with a cow and a little church in the background. I'm a neurologist, I'm a doctor, so I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a toxicologist. You can call me a concerned neurologist because the welfare of people with Parkinson's is very, very close to my heart. And I think there is something going wrong in the world, which I want to discuss with you today. I often get the question, does Parkinson's matter on a global scale? And it does in many ways. This is a paper that we published just last year in The Lancet, which, as you know, is a very prestigious medical journal. It's a very comprehensive review of Parkinson's disease and insights into what's happening in the brain, major developments in terms of new treatments. If anything, I would call it a document of hope, because although I can't promise that there will be a cure within the near future, I have serious hopes, and there will be more news about that later in my presentation, that we may start to witness the arrival of the first disease-modifying treatments that can slow down the progression of Parkinson's. And I think it was an urgent call for personalized precision medicine. You are all different. Sometimes people ask me whether it's not boring to dedicate your life to Parkinson's. Well, it isn't for a whole variety of reasons, but the main reason is you. Everybody's different. Parkinson's presents itself differently. The treatments act differently in different people. Your wishes, needs, preferences, how you deal with the disease is all different. So in this paper in The Lancet, we argued that there is no such thing as Parkinson's disease, we said there are 10 million Parkinson's diseases, namely as many as there are individuals living with this condition in the world. And I purposely use the word individual or person. I hate the word patient. I try to get it out of the diary. And in this paper, which is 19 pages in print in the Lancet, we used the word patient only 3 times, which was a slip of the pen, I suppose, in hindsight. And we otherwise consistently speak of persons, individuals, or families, for that matter, with Parkinson's disease. And as a tribute to your uniqueness and to emphasize how different people are, we made this beautiful film based with photography of individuals living with the disease who all bring their own unique items to emphasize what they find important. And there's a beautiful song that comes with it. I hope you can hear it.
There are 10 million Parkinsons in the world, and it grows so fast we cannot deny. We need a lot of different ways to turn the tide. We need 10 million treatments of this disease. No one's the same, so the remedy needs change. They all deserve a tailored treatment to their needs.
Well, the video wasn't running as smoothly on my machine as it was supposed to, but I think you get the message about, just look at this final picture. You know, these are 20 people living with Parkinson's, men and women, young and old, black and white, people of all different sorts of backgrounds. There's even a pregnant young woman on the left. She's got young onset Parkinson's disease. I think this movie and the accompanying song, which you can find, by the way, on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, is to my mind a real tribute to your uniqueness, but also to your resilience. I'm always so deeply impressed by how people and families deal with this difficult disease. Now, Parkinson's is a fast-growing disease. These are all singers that have recently heard that they have, or musicians who recently heard that they have Parkinson's disease. These are actors who recently heard that they have Parkinson's disease. This is a famous French chef who recently heard that he has Parkinson's disease, Paul Bocuse. And these are all athletes who recently heard that they have Parkinson's disease. And you can already see that Parkinson's spares no one. Politicians get Parkinson's disease. This is Colin Powell, who recently died, not of, but with Parkinson's disease. And I can already hear all of you think, my boy, these are all men, and that's true. Parkinson's is more common in men than in women, although the percentage of women is about 45, 46%. So these images are by no way a real reflection of the outside world, and there is clearly a difference in the way men and women with Parkinson's have their coming out. So there's a clear bias here in how they deal with the healthcare system, access to therapies, how the disease presents itself. So this is not for today, but I'm increasingly interested in the differences between men and women with Parkinson's disease. These are tremendous. And I think these illustrations of men is another illustration of that very difference. This is a male, again, a famous Dutch folk singer, Rob de Nijs. This is another famous opera singer in the Netherlands. Again, a man, but women do get Parkinson's disease. This is Linda Ronstadt. And again, there are many women with Parkinson's in the world, but for some reason, the attention is drawn to men. And this is interesting, and I think it's telling us a little bit about healthcare behavior and the differences between men and women. And it increasingly affects young people. This is a beautiful photograph taken from a magazine that we published in the Netherlands. The man on the left is 35. The man on the right is 85. They both have the same disease, but you can easily see how the wishes and needs of the man on the left are very different from the wishes and needs from the man on the right. The man on the left has issues around work, maybe relationships, wants to see his children go to university. The man on the right maybe wants to make a few more trips with his wife, see his grandchildren. They're all different and unique. Now, the disease is growing fast. In this paper, with my good friend Ray Dorsey, we drew attention for the first time that Parkinson's is the fastest growing neurological condition in the world. And we've called it the Parkinson Pandemic. And of course, this is a time where everybody speaks of a pandemic. It's called the COVID pandemic. Parkinson's is truly a pandemic. A pandemic, by definition, is a disease that is occurring worldwide, grows fast, spares no one, men, women, young, old, has a devastating impact on the lives of people. And Parkinson's ticks all those boxes, except for an infectious origin, although there are now some scattered case reports, just case reports, that COVID, as one of its many consequences, could cause maybe Parkinson's. But that's early days and we still don't know, and we have to monitor the figures in the coming years. If I forget to tell you, I think it is critical that you get your full vaccination. People with Parkinson's are at risk of the severe consequences of COVID. Even people who have been vaccinated twice have double the risk of dying or ending up on the intensive care compared to people who are doubly vaccinated without Parkinson's. So get your booster vaccination is my main message. There are no concerns that the vaccine interacts with the disease. There are no concerns that it interacts with your medication. Yes, you could temporarily experience a minor worsening of Parkinson's because the disease is in fact elicited in mild form by the vaccine in some, but that's not permanent, and the protective effects clearly outweigh the possible adverse effects. Now, our claim that Parkinson's is a pandemic was based on a whole number of studies that all point in the same direction. This is a paper by Rodolfo Savica, neurologist in the United States, basically showing a fast growth of Parkinson's disease, both in men and in women. Although the interesting part is that the disease appeared to grow a bit faster in men as compared to women, but it's growing fast in both groups. And one interesting element here is smoking. So this next paper, which came out in the Movement Disorders Journal, is not to be distributed outside the realms of this conference or this mini meeting. I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but what this paper drew attention to is that these are data from the United States, is that the proportion of people in the US who are never smokers, the dark triangles, is increasing, whereas the proportion of smokers is decreasing. And we have known for quite some time that smoking, for some reason, is associated with a protective effect against Parkinson's. That's not to say that smoking itself protects against Parkinson's. I think that evidence is weak, but there is a negative association. And what they are claiming is that because of the reduction in smoking behavior, which is a desired development, we will see an extra increase in Parkinson's in the gray line as compared to the dark line, which would be the prevalence in Parkinson's if we continued smoking as we used to do. Please, please, please don't take this as evidence that you should start smoking. We don't know why this is. There could be all sorts of spurious associations. There's many reasons to believe that smoking is actually not itself protective. And even so, then the negative effects of smoking, lung cancer, heart disease, etc., clearly outweigh any possible beneficial effect on Parkinson's. Now, this was a paper that really influenced my thinking about Parkinson's. It's the so-called Global Burden of Neurological Disorders survey, which is done, I think, annually. And this paper was published in the Lancet Neurology. And what these people showed, and I realize this is a bit of a busy slide, but I walk you through it. What you see here in the left column is 3 major neurological conditions: stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease. And what you see here in the top column for stroke is that after correction for age, so we all get older. This is why stroke becomes more common, Alzheimer's becomes more common, Parkinson's becomes more common. But if you correct for the aging effect, stroke, do you see the minus numbers? Stroke is actually diminishing. And this is because we are better at preventing stroke by a healthy lifestyle. Alzheimer's disease is slightly diminishing or remains more or less stable. It means that the growth in Alzheimer's disease is completely explained by the fact that we are getting older. The only disease in this article which was not focusing on Parkinson's in particular, it was looking at any neurological condition and developments in the world. The only condition that stood out was Parkinson's disease, which is growing because of aging. But even after correction for aging, it is still growing, which means something extra is happening. And we think that something extra is toxins in our environment. And by the way, I personally don't think that aging itself is a cause of Parkinson's. I think aging means you get older, which means you have had more time to be exposed to toxic chemicals. So it's not aging itself. I think aging is also a reflection of toxicity in the environment. I'll skip this one for now. And some people have said, well, perhaps Parkinson's is growing because we are better at diagnosing Parkinson's disease. But that's clearly not the case. At the bottom line, you see in blue, multiple sclerosis. We are today much better in diagnosing multiple sclerosis than, say, 20 years ago, and definitely compared to 1910, because now we have MRI scans, cerebral spinal fluid, the lumbar tap, and despite markedly improved diagnostics, MS is hardly increasing. Parkinson's disease is a diagnosis which you make with your bare hands, listening to an individual, talking to the individual, doing a proper neurological exam. We diagnose Parkinson's disease today the way Charcot did it in the 19th century. So we are not having any better testing for Parkinson's, yet the disease is growing fast, much faster than multiple sclerosis. So it's not the fact that we're better doctors. Genetic factors definitely are one cause of Parkinson's. This is common in people who develop young onset Parkinson's disease. By young, I mean under 40, probably under 50. We have various forms of Parkinson's. You can see these here in the left column. But together, this is rare. Together, this is explaining maybe 20% of Parkinson's. So all the rest is not genetic. And this is fascinating, and you see this in the right column. These genes interact with environmental factors like pesticides or heavy metals. So probably having a gene is not enough to get Parkinson's. It makes you vulnerable, or I should say extra vulnerable, when you're exposed to a chemical. It's like grain, seeds that need to fall on ripe soil. Just the clay doesn't produce a crop. And just the grain doesn't produce a crop either. If you put it on a road, you need it both. And the interaction between genes and the environment is now a matter of hefty debate and investigation in the scientific community. It increases your vulnerability. I will also skip this one. And this is interesting. So these are data from the United Kingdom, where you see the growth of Parkinson's for men and women, and you see it growing in both men and women. And what I find fascinating, and credits to my friend Ray Dorsey, who created this slide, this is the graph for lung cancer. And it looks identical. Lung cancer, there's no debate. That's an environmental disease. It's caused by a toxin called smoking. Just look at the two graphs. I just go back and forth. They're identical. So even the differences between men and women, and of course, if we think about pesticides, the farmers are typically men. If you think about trichloroethylene and heavy metals, men are more likely to be exposed than women. So some of those gender differences, just as we have seen in differences in smoking behavior for lung cancer, can explain the increase in Parkinson's disease in men relative to women. So I think those two graphs are interesting and fascinating. So taken together, we think that Parkinson's is not entirely, but at least to a large extent, man-made, just like the pyramids in Egypt, created by man. These were not happening automatically. They were built by human beings. And we think Parkinson's disease is also to at least a large extent caused by human beings. And if you come to think of it, James Parkinson, a physician in London, described the disease for the first time in the year 1817. This is the time when the Industrial Revolution was taking place in England, in London in particular. The smog, you know, all the famous images. Prior to 1817, Parkinson's was a very, very, very rare disease. It did exist. There are scattered occasional reports of Parkinson patients, but it was a rare disease. And it is no coincidence that James Parkinson described this disease for the first time in London around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Parkinson's disease is, of course, related to aging. So the fact that people grew less old prior to 1817 could be an explanation. But even prior to 1817, some people did get very old. And because Parkinson's cannot be missed, it is so visible, particularly when it's untreated, it must have caught people's eyes prior to 1817, and it didn't. So it was maybe existent, but rare prior to the Industrial Revolution. And if you now look at this graph, this is a paper we published again with my friend Ray Dorsey and Professor Michael Oken. Here you see the growth in gross domestic product on the x-axis. So the more you go to the right, the greater the growth in the economy, i.e. the greater the environmental pollution. On the y-axis, you see the growth in Parkinson's disease. And the disease the country that sticks out is China. And of course, China is now having their industrial revolution. This is an image of 2020 China. And the disease is exploding in China. And this is, we think, at least to an extent related to air pollution. I will be relatively brief about air pollution today, but a number of studies have linked Parkinson's disease to air pollution. This is the explanation for 1817, James Parkinson. It's probably a partial explanation for today's pandemic. It's an explanation for the explosion in China. So air pollution is one of the factors that causes Parkinson's disease. Another factor is head trauma. This is one of my patients, Marina Noordegraaf, who drafted this brilliant cartoon of the famous Muhammad Ali punching his own brain. As you know, he developed Parkinson's, which we suspect may have been related to the repeated head injury. Definitely, repeated head injury is linked in some way to the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So what you can already see, remember I talked about 10 million Parkinson's diseases. There isn't just one disease. There isn't one cause. There are many different causes. We heard about genes. We heard about air pollution. We're now hearing about head trauma. But the one thing that I want to talk about in particular today is pesticides. Pesticides are a tremendous concern. This is again Marina Noordegraaf, the patient of mine who drafted this brilliant cartoon where pesticide slowly converts into Parkinson's to emphasize the link between the two. Pesticide use in the world has increased dramatically since the Second World War. And this was necessary to feed a fast-growing worldwide population. But these pesticides, unfortunately, do not come for free. This is one example, paraquat, which in the United States, I'm actually not certain about Canada. I hope it's forbidden in Canada. I think it is. But in the United States, which is unbelievable, paraquat, which has been linked in over 20 studies to Parkinson's, is still being used. In fact, its use is growing. It's very toxic to the substantia nigra, the area involved in Parkinson's in mice and in rats. Farmers exposed to paraquat have an increased risk of developing the disease. It's been forbidden in 60 countries in the world, even in China, and the Americans are still using it. And the lobby of the industry is very powerful. I know that among others, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Ray Dorsey and others are fighting to get a ban on paraquat, but so far it's unsuccessful. Why do we feel that these pesticides are the cause of Parkinson's? Not only do we see strong epidemiological evidence, and I will give you a few examples in a minute, but if you feed pesticides to a mouse or to a rat, then the rat will develop Parkinsonian signs. It will become stiff and slow. And if you kill the mouse and look at the brain, the area that's involved in Parkinson's is damaged. So the epidemiological work shows an association. The rodent work shows that this association is actually a causal relationship. And what is, I would say, fascinating, but maybe disconcerting to think about is who is at risk. And obviously, the closer you are to these pesticides, the greater your risk. So no one in the world has a higher risk of developing Parkinson's than farmers. So oftentimes when I lecture about this topic, people feel that I'm accusing farmers. I'm not accusing farmers of anything. Farmers try to do a decent job and have an honest profession. I wish these farmers a healthy life. They are at the highest risk of being exposed to these pesticides and developing Parkinson's. But the concerning fact is that nearby residents, people who live in the immediate vicinity of these crops where these pesticides are being used, also have, in a number of studies, a significantly higher risk of developing Parkinson's. And what I will point out to you towards the end of my talk is that ultimately every citizen in Canada, the United States, Netherlands, elsewhere in the world is at risk because it reaches the food chain. These pesticides can be found in measurable concentrations in food products in supermarkets today. I will show you some evidence which is not making me happy, and it should, lead to immediate action. So what is the epidemiological evidence? I first want to pay credit to a wonderful neurologist from Canada. This is André Barbeau, who died the year after I started medical school. And he died at the age of 55. He was from French Canada, Montreal, I think. And everything he did was brilliant. he was the first to draw attention to pesticides. And all of the work that he published had a great degree of veracity, of truth in it. And until today, I'd never looked up a photograph. And so this is a new slide for me. And I just think he also looks just like a friendly man. And I wish I'd never met him, never shaken hands, never seen him, never met him. But his work is influential. And this is what was written about him after he died. He was the first. You see there his quote, "Yes, the environment seemed to favor the onset of the disease." And he was credited for having great scientific intuition and a great pioneering spirit. So I wanted to use this opportunity to pay credit to Dr. André Barbeau. And this is a seminal paper published in 1987, a year after he died. So he was onto something. And this was the first time he'd begun to worry about the environment, made the discovery, wrote up the paper, and passed away. So post-mortem, this paper came out, and it was the first paper in the world to draw attention to what we now see as a significant factor in Parkinson's, namely the role of pesticides. What he did as the first one in the world is draw a map of the Quebec area. And what he said is, if Parkinson's is unrelated to the environment, there should be an equal number of people with Parkinson's in each of these geographical areas. It should be like a porridge, where each part of the porridge tastes exactly the same. But what you can see is there are areas with a lot of Parkinson's in black and areas in light gray with little Parkinson's. And he went on to show with measurements in hydrographic basins that there were much more pesticides in precisely those areas where there was more Parkinson's, and there was more agriculture in the areas with more pesticides. And in a graph, he even showed a dose-response relationship. So on the x-axis, the further you go to the right, the higher the concentration of the pesticides in a water basin, and on the y-axis, the number of patients with Parkinson's disease. And there is a relationship between the two, which I think is stunning. This is 1987, and then he died, and people buried the topic for some time, unfortunately. Another French-speaking person who picked this up is Alexis Elbaz, wonderful neurologist from France, who has published seminal papers looking at the same situation in France. So he looked at André Barbeau's work, this so-called heat map study, and he replicated this heat map study in France. And this is France, you'll recognize it. And what you can see is Parkinson's, just like in Quebec, is not equally distributed across the country, but there are areas in France, in dark red, where there is more Parkinson's than in others. And it overlaps nearly perfectly with wine regions and the use of pesticides. So the French have now replicated the findings that were made earlier in Canada. And here you see a scientific graph on the y-axis, the risk of Parkinson's, on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, the proportion of agricultural land, and the more agricultural land, the more Parkinson patients. And finally, study has also been replicated in the United States. This is Louisiana, where again, you see a heat map, which is not showing a porridge, but it's showing pockets, hotspots of Parkinson's, which again, in their analysis, overlap perfectly with the use of pesticides and agriculture. So I think there is a very clear signal. It's the same in Holland, and we're doing a new study, but I'm deeply convinced by these studies. So this is in Dutch. This was an interview with me in a leading Dutch journal, where we discussed the fact that the French have now accepted Parkinson's as an occupational hazard disease among wine farmers. The Germans are considering to take a similar step. What is vexing and quite frankly bizarre is that the tulip is, I hope you know this, but the tulip is the international symbol of the fight against Parkinson's disease. The very same tulip in the Netherlands is associated with the risk of Parkinson's. So when the Dutch did their heat map study, it turns out that in the tulip areas, there is more Parkinson's disease. So there's this bizarre double relationship between pesticides as the symbol of our joint fight, and at the same time, conveying a risk of developing the same disease. And of course, and what you now see, and this is what really concerns me, is you see the counter forces. So people say, if we stop the tulips now, the Netherlands will lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, frankly, I couldn't care less. We're talking about people's health. But there you can see the economic interests. I participated in a debate with the House of Commons just this Thursday in Holland, arguing for a ban of pesticides. And then people said, but then the world population will starve. So they try to startle us by installing fear. But there are now biological excellent alternatives that can guarantee healthy crops without pesticides. And as I told you, there are 3 rings of exposure. It's the farmers, it's the immediate vicinity, but it's also everyone through the food chain. One element which could be related is dairy products. A number of studies, and these are all examples, have linked a lifetime consumption of milk or milk products to the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. This is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a summary of all those individual studies. They're lumping them all together. So this is the most powerful analysis we have in science. And what you can see, it's a bit of a scientific thing, but you can see the blue triangles, or what is it, diamonds, and they are positioned towards the right of the vertical line, meaning that there is a significant risk when all the different studies are pooled together. So it is quite clear that there is an association between lifetime consumption of dairy products, milk, cheese, butter, and the subsequent risk of developing Parkinson's. Now, just to make clear, we don't know the exact relationship yet, but it could be through pesticides. Here you see another graph. You see milk intake on the horizontal axis, so the more to the right, the greater your lifetime milk intake, and the risk is on the y-axis. And you see that there's a correlation between the two. The more milk intake, the higher the risk of developing Parkinson's. And there is one, but this is only literally one very provocative study, which we discuss in our book, which is going back to Hawaii, where farmers successfully claimed to be allowed to use heptachlor, a toxic pesticide, on their crops to produce pineapples. The pesticide which they were using found its way to milk in the supermarkets. It found its way to the breast milk of feeding mothers, and it was later found in the substantia nigra of people who had passed away after death. They found it in the brains. Now, that's only one study, and I will not make the claim here that all studies that have linked dairy products to Parkinson's are through pesticides. There are alternative explanations, and in the Netherlands, most milk products are safe. Particularly for the women who are listening today, you need milk for your bone health. So I think it is too early to tell whether whether, what the relationship, what the nature of the relationship is. I think it is wise to avoid an excess of dairy products. I would recommend to eat biological if you can, but not to refrain from milk, because you need it. You need the calcium for bone health. And one other possible explanation for milk: people who eat lots and lots of cheese tend to be more obese, and a number of studies have shown that obesity is also a risk factor for Parkinson's. So this is an example of how milk could cause Parkinson's through other mechanisms than pesticides. But the fact of the matter is, there is an association, a number of studies between milk and Parkinson's. Whether it's pesticides, that I don't know. What I do know is that most of us like a glass of red wine, perhaps a French red wine, but pesticides make their way into wine in supermarkets. A stunning study in the Netherlands, in which I participated, examined wine and other food products in Dutch supermarkets. They tested 3 major supermarket chains. They looked at bottles of red wine, and all bottles that were examined contained Roundup, glyphosate, the weed killer that many of us have used in some sort to kill weed in our gardens. Roundup, glyphosate, has been linked to Parkinson's in a number of studies, and it's present in measurable concentrations in wine in Dutch supermarkets, which we buy in 2022 today. I think it's mind-boggling. They also took samples of grapes, strawberries, onions, melons, and more than half of the food products in the Netherlands contained one, or typically more than one, pesticide in measurable concentrations. So it reaches the food chain. So I recommend everybody to carefully wash their fruit and vegetables. I learned from toxicologists that you need a little bit of soap to wash it extra carefully, because otherwise you don't get the pesticides, you don't get rid of it well enough. And finally, before we move to the discussion, I just wanted to say that the government often says, well, there are measurable concentrations of pesticides in food, but it's below allowed toxic levels. And the problem is, that is not true. This is a report in Dutch, but it supports the claims that we make in our book, namely that the procedures that are used worldwide to allow pesticides onto the market are wrong. What they are doing in order to allow a pesticide onto the market is feed a mouse a pesticide. And in order to test for neurotoxicity, damage to the nervous system, they look at the occurrence of clinically discernible manifest symptoms in the mouse. And if the mouse looks physically healthy, the pesticide is considered to be bona fide and allowed onto the market. The problem is that the brain has a huge reserve. Parkinson's only arises clinically if you've lost more than 70% of your dopamine cells. So if a pesticide would cause damage to 65% of the cells, the mouse looks perfectly healthy, everybody happy, the pesticide is allowed onto the market, but it doesn't mean it's safe. It doesn't mean it's safe. So what is considered a safe toxic concentration hasn't been properly tested. And the extra problem is that farmers typically use cocktails of pesticides. And in the screening procedures, a mouse is being fed only one pesticide. But the reality is that you and I are exposed to mixtures, to cocktails of pesticides. Farmers typically use up to 5 pesticides on their crops. And even if they don't, if the neighbor uses a different pesticide, it blows in the wind and contaminates the adjacent farmland. So cocktails arise automatically. And the latest of the latest work in California has shown A, that cocktails are common, and that certain cocktails are related to Parkinson's, even if the individual compound is not necessarily suspicious. So I think I would only be reassured if proper testing has been done in animals, not just for single pesticides, but also for commonly occurring cocktails, where the animal is sacrificed and cell counts have been done in a substantia nigra, which is involved in Parkinson's disease. Now, in the final quick minute, just a little bit on protective factors. There are risk factors and there are protective factors. And for many of these, it's still a black box as to how they're working, but I just wanted to give you a bit of hope and courage. A Mediterranean diet conveys a lower risk of Parkinson's disease. We don't know whether the same Mediterranean diet conveys the same benefits if you already have the disease, but I tell all my patients, try to adhere to a Mediterranean diet. This is a paper that showed, it's a bit of details. Coffee, 3 to 4 cups of coffee, if you like it, is associated with a lower risk of developing Parkinson's. Whether it works when you have the disease, we don't know. I recommend my patients, if you like it, take a few cups of coffee each day. And finally, before we close, exercise is a drug for Parkinson's. It helps to suppress motor symptoms, but our latest work is incredibly cool and encouraging. It was published just last week. You're the first in the world to hear. This is a study that we published in 2019. It was a study where we invited people with Parkinson's to exercise 3 times a week on a stationary bicycle at home for 30 to 45 minutes. And the right dose is when you start to pant, but you can still maintain a conversation. 3 times a week, 30 to 45 minutes, panting. The control group was just doing stretching exercises. The results showed that the control group declined over a 6-month period, which is what you would expect. The exercise group was stable, did not decline. And what we have just published, it's completely fresh. The ink is still wet. It will be published in the Annals of Neurology, is the results of brain scans. We did brain scans before and after exercise in both the stretching group and in the exercise group. And lo and behold, we showed that the brain made new functional connections between the basal ganglia and the healthy brain cortex. So adaptive plasticity of the brain after exercise. We are all desperately hoping for a treatment that will one day slow down Parkinson's. There are many drugs that are being tested. The one intervention that is closest in the world today is exercise, which you can do today. You can start today. And if you ever feel poorly motivated to exercise, think of this study. New sprouting in your brain when you're exercising. And this is the paper, Annals of Neurology. We're exceptionally proud. I think it's a groundbreaking study. And we also showed that the amount of atrophy, the shrinking of the brain, was stopped by the aerobic exercise. I mean, an incredible finding. Sprouting of new connections and less atrophy. So to sum it up, if you want to read a little bit more about this, this is the book Ending Parkinson's Disease. I published this paper, this book with Ray Dorsey, Todd Shearer, and Michael Oken, all close friends. This is the Queen of the Netherlands who received a Dutch version of the book. She looks exceptionally happy, as you can see. It's almost as if her husband just proposed to her, but it was only the book. You can order the book on this website, www.endingpd.org. I'm not promoting my own income here. All proceeds go to the greater good, to efforts to end Parkinson's disease. So I hope that you will support all of us in this effort, I think you should buy the book, read the book, and finally become an activist. I've talked extensively about the role of the environment. I think it is a shame that this is still happening. Parkinson's is partially man-made. It means it's partially preventable. The book is a call to action more than anything else. So I hope that you will all become advocates. You probably already are, but we need to be loud, we need to be heard, and we need to make every effort to ultimately end Parkinson's disease. And I want to end, this is my final slide, with a quote of my good friend Tom Isaacs, who had young onset Parkinson's. He sadly died away, not because of Parkinson's, he had a gastric hemorrhage, just poor luck. But Tom said, this is a time of cautious hope instead of conservative paternalism. And I share that opinion, and I wish you all the best. And we'll move to the, I'll finish sharing the screen and move to the questions in the chat. So somebody says paraquat is still used in Canada. This is Jean Blake. Thank you. Although the government did increase regulations around its sale. So that's incredible, Jean, that it's still being used in Canada. I think that's a shame. I think you should not accept it. So advocacy in your country to try and ban paraquat ASAP, I think, is desperately needed. But thank you for this message. Parkinson's is also accepted in Quebec as an occupational hazard for people exposed to pesticides, is what Jean is also adding. I think that is a good message. Maybe thanks to the work of the late André Barbeau. There's a call to action by Silke, which is, by the way, a Dutch first name, Silke. So there you go, my introduction. Let's work together to achieve this in British Columbia as well. Let's see. Oh, somebody says Bob de Wit. Bob de Wit is as Dutch as you can get it. Says "Dank u wel, Bas," which means thank you, Bas. So I immediately feel at home now. Thank you, Bob, for this kind personal message in my mother tongue. Please show the name of the book again, says Janice. It's called Ending Parkinson's Disease, and the website is endingpd.org. But I'm sure that we can share it. I can actually type it quickly here, endingpd.org. There you go. And Susan says, it's a great read. Thank you, Susan. That's nice to hear, to know that we didn't do this for nothing. Let's see. Gina Lupino says, curious if anyone knows these stats for ALS and MS. And I know that ALS has also been linked to environmental factors. MS has a funny relationship to the environment. It is virtually absent around the equator, and it's much more common the more north and the more south you go. So there is an environmental factor there as well. Probably is, the longer you look at it, it is actually stunning what we are doing to ourselves. Heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. Many of these diseases are man-made, and I think it really is a call to action. I've called the Parkinson's disease a cannery in the mine. You know, the mine workers in the old days used to have a cannery, the bird, to screen for toxicity. And if the cannery stopped singing, then the air was toxic, and you needed to get out of the mine as quickly as possible. So it was an early warning sign. And I think Parkinson's is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a visible, recognizable condition, but it's not the only disease linked to the environment. And I really think we should act, and we should act quickly. Going to the bottom here, Paul Luke says there may be a fourth ring of exposure to pesticides. In my 20s, I worked in the plant packaging pesticides. Yes, absolutely, Paul. I think industry workers may also be at risk. I think you're absolutely right. David says, I worked for 44 years in the steel business and was diagnosed with PD. Yes, I have not been comprehensive, David, but heavy metals are also among the environmental factors that have been clearly linked to Parkinson's. It includes manganese, for example. Welders have an increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And another chemical that I haven't mentioned because I focused on the pesticides today is trichloroethylene. And trichloroethylene is a degreaser, also used in the steel industry. It's also part of shoe polish. The good old whiteout used to contain trichloroethylene. It's used to in laundries. And trichloroethylene is also very toxic to the substantia nigra. It's very likely to be an important cause of Parkinson's. A concern with trichloroethylene is that when industry dumps it into the environment, it's very persistent. It may move underground and then evaporate where you inhale it without knowing, and it can cause Parkinson's. In Camp Lejeune, the training site for the American Army, there's a lot of pollution with trichloroethylene, and there's a lot of Parkinson's among veterans as a result. So your work, David, in the steel industry may be either the heavy metals or perhaps the trichloroethylene. I see very many people saying that they were happy with the talk, so that's always nice to say. And there's no moderator to say it, so I'm the only one to read it out. Is it possible to provide a link to your recent paper on exercise? Yep, of course, but I will do that with your host today so that she'll be able to reach out to you today. Farmers are at risk, but have studies been done on ex-military personnel? So Richard, this is Richard Wall. I didn't see your question, but I already mentioned Camp Lejeune. So yes, veterans are at risk. Agent Orange is another factor that has been linked to Parkinson's, which has been used, as you know, widely in the Vietnam War. So veterans, either through training at Camp Lejeune and trichloroethylene, or perhaps compounds like Agent Orange are also a high risk group for developing Parkinson's disease. Is there a relationship between dentists and PD? Is what Mel Schneider, I think, I can't see the full name, but I suppose it's Schneider. That I don't know. There have been concerns have been expressed that dental fillings could be a cause of Parkinson's disease. When they still contained heavy metals, the modern dental fillings are no longer a risk, is what people believe, but the older could have been contributing to the risk of Parkinson's. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure about dentists. It would make sense, it could be possible, but I just don't know. It means I haven't read about it, which may be my ignorance, or it could mean that it's maybe not all that common. People continue to say that they were happy with the presentation, which is nice. Thank you for continuing to spread the word. Yep, well done. My pleasure. Let's see. Yeah. Somebody said I worked in a farm without protective equipment. This is Deborah, and I think this is another item. So we need to do a number of things. We need to ban the most suspicious pesticides, ASAP, paraquat, probably Roundup. We need to screen all pesticides for toxicity in adequate rodent models, as I explained. Also testing cocktails. And while we wait for that outcome, farmers, people living in the vicinity, should have protective materials, better, I'm not sure, air conditioning is not the right word, but means to clean the air. Farmers should wear protective gloves and protective equipment. And of course, all citizens should hopefully move to biological food. There should be a push towards biological food products. And in the meantime, wash all your food products, in particular your veggies and fruit, as carefully as possible. The there are a number of references. Somebody asked me about the references that point out the association between Roundup and Parkinson's. I will share those with the host so that people can see the references. There are 3 case reports, 1 epidemiological study, and 1 mouse study. And just today, as I was preparing my talk, I found a 2nd epidemiological study. I think it is too early to say that Roundup is a cause of Parkinson's, but given that other pesticides have a proven relationship, that there are these case reports, epidemiological work and rodent work, given that the screening procedures are not right, we have every reason to be worried. And I think Bayer, who acquired Monsanto, should take the initiative to test Roundup for Parkinson risk and get it off the market if it is suspicious. So does decaffeinated coffee have the same protective effect as regular coffee? Is a question by Helen. And Helen, I should know the answer. I think it was the caffeine and not the decaf, but I'm saying this off the top of my head. I will check that for you. And if it's different, I will share it through through your host for today. But I'm quite sure it was the caffeine that was doing the trick and not the decaf. I'm quite sure. But if it's different, you will hear. So we've reached the bottom of the hour. I'm looking at the host.
Dr. Bloem,
yeah.
I guess those are all of our questions and comments. I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and it's truly been an honor to have you speak for us. And thank you for your important message that, we do need to be loud to make change. And also our CEO, Jean Blake, she's also written a message that Parkinson Society BC is working to develop an advocacy campaign here in BC to end the use of paraquat. But there are 3 levels of policymakers that, have to be dealt with as a federal, provincial, and municipal. But if you are interested, we do need advocates to help. And so you can always contact Jean about that. And I also want to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments. And I will see you at our upcoming webinar.
There's one question by Catherine. I just saw that,
Sure.
whether green tea has the same protective effect. And Catherine, it's what I believe is black tea has also some protective effects, but not green tea. So if tea is your choice, then black tea appears to be better than green tea. So final quick answer. Okay. So thank you all for your attention, and stay safe, and wishing you all well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloem. And if there are any links or the book title, well, I can pass on the book title, but if there are any links that you want to send me to pass on to the attendees, I can do that. If you just email.
Well, if I hope you took minutes, and then you can send me an email just asking me for some references, and I'm happy to share that. In particular, the exercise paper. Sure. This is important for all people in Canada. It's so funny to see all these Dutch names. Randy Oldhuis, also a very Dutch name. I'm happy to share the slides as a PDF, so you can also ask me. So Randy, I'm happy to share the slides, but only as a PDF. I will keep the originals.
Yes,
and
so,
you can find.
I think you gave us permission to share the slides on our website, so they will be posted on our website.
Oh, perfect. The video, the recording.
The recording and the slides.
Yeah,
if
perfect.
you are okay with that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, stay safe, everyone, and hope to see you in person somewhere in the future if the COVID crisis allows. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks again, Dr. Bloem. Bye-bye.